Hey there, welcome to episode 144 of the Quaggling Sand audio program. I am your host, Dan Hugo, as usual. We're recording this at 2:16 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time here in Greater Vegas on Wednesday, August 12, 2026. We normally publish new episodes of Quaggling Sand sometime on Wednesday. Could be the morning, could be the afternoon. It has been the evening sometimes, but usually every Wednesday. So we're there. Today's title and topic, motive power. Not the top, it's the title and topic. It's not the general notion of motive power, although I do have the definition of motive power in the links. Instead, it is a startup I was one of 4 people working on in Silicon Valley a long time ago, somewhere in 2000. Motive power. If you're not familiar with Quaggling Sand, it is a sort of a vanity personal essay, audio essay website / audio program. There is a website for Quaggling Sand. It doesn't have much on it right now. It is pretty much me, no real opportunities for guests. It is tales, recollections, stories, meanderings of various things through my own personal history. They may be interesting, informative, educational, who knows? Maybe you're on the treadmill right now and this is helping you pass some time. That's good. Good for both of us. Motive power. Quaggling sand, by the way, is a technical term I coined when I was very young. You probably use the term pins and needles. Quaggling sand is that sensation you get when circulation is returning to a limb, usually, a hand or a foot, maybe an arm or a leg. You can use it if you want. Impress your friends. Quaggling sand. In this context, it is the swirling of sand in the mind, like an hourglass, through time, backwards perhaps. So let's talk about motive power. Hopefully, wherever you found this audio program, you're able to locate the episode description, which contains the show notes, including a brief summary, which I'll read to you, and the 3 links for today's episode. Let's get started. I think our heat wave is over here in Vegas, so the weather is actually kind of nice. It's not as hot inside nor outside, but apparently some sort of an on-screen animation with possibly lightning. Maybe it's raining. I should go outside more. I was outside this morning at 7:30. The weather was fine. Let's get on with it. The summary of today's episode: a startup you have never heard of, named after something you have never known the name of, a Silicon Valley tale. Quaggling Sand homepage, Quoggling, quaggling, just like it sounds. sand.com. You could confuse it for quagglings and I don't know. You could. Quagglingsand.com. Someday it will have more stuff on it. Profile page linking everything. buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo. I've had this profile page set up on that platform since March of 2021. So it's 5 years and some months. You don't have to spend any money if you visit there, but you will find links to all of my various audio programs, projects. There are some affiliate links. But again, you don't have to spend any money if you don't want to. The Buy Me an Update audio program is published there first, hence the name. It's otherwise unaffiliated. And then that program is published every Monday. First there, then all the other usual places. 5 minutes, quick rundown on the previous week's audio program topics, and news and announcements for the upcoming week. So whatever you listen to on this week's Monday edition of that program, you already know what's going on. And the definition of motive power from Merriam-Webster website. Motive power is like a driving force. You might see maybe a locomotive or a power plant, something that makes data centers do their data centering. Motive power. In this case, it was a name selected by the founder of the startup for which we would pursue its goals. Motive power. I think he was sort of, he was a computer engineer. So probably thinking more along the lines of like voltage, power, electricity generation. But motive power can take a variety of forms. Driving force. That seems like a good enough for now. You can check out the definition, and there's a Wikipedia page for a different company. I will point out that this company that we're about to speak of, I don't think there's any online presence. You may be able to find, maybe there was probably a patent filing. Maybe you would probably be able to find the formation of a corporation at some point somewhere. However, it's essentially scrubbed from memory. The world knows nothing more of motive power in the example I'm about to describe here today, in the form I'm about to, yeah. So let's talk about it in the beginning. I have mentioned my time at UMax and at Philips, both in Silicon Valley. But what about in between there? Well, as luck would have it, I was entangled, sort of, in a 4-person startup called Motive Power. Let's introduce some characters and we will assume you already know me. 2 of the other characters were at UMax. One I knew for a long time prior to UMax. We'll call that person K. And the other I met at UMax, D. Not to be confused with me. The 4th character I met through D. We can call him J. So D, J, and K and myself were the 4 people involved day to day. Why am I not showing their names? Well, because I didn't ask if I could tell this story with their names included. So why put them on Front Street? So just initials. If you go through the effort of tracking down what Motive Power was, and you can, well then, good for you. Recall, or I can remind you here, if you haven't listened before, UMax was a startup company designing and building Mac clones when there were such things, funded by the UMax group in Taiwan. And toward the end, we switched over to making Intel machines. That was kind of an interesting twist in the story, I suppose. With Intel literally right up the street, maybe 1/4 the distance, rather than going through the Apple headquarters in Cupertino, proximity was actually a benefit, and Intel was quite helpful, as we were to be the first company to launch Slot 1 processor design. So if you are a computer nerd, you know this was a while ago. We did have Slot 1 processors. We had AGP, thanks to a bug in the BX chipset. At the time, we had AGP running at 100 megahertz instead of 66, which was twice the PCI clock. So those early days, kind of interesting, kind of fun stuff going on. Intel was quite helpful as in general too, so that was nice. We had to bring in someone to work on hardware design since we just had a layoff. I've told that story before. So UMax was kind of going through a re-emergence, a reboot of itself. I reached out to Kay. He came up, we all met up, everybody hit it off, and so we all banged out our first 2 Slot 1 designs, motherboards, like magic. It was a pretty good team, actually. I mean, yeah, all things considered, I think we had a future. Unfortunately, the company did not. We shut down the company. I was actually on vacation. Got called in, hey, if you're around, why don't you come in and we're having a company meeting to talk about the big change, which was we are no longer in business. Yeah, that's a long story in of itself. But not everybody, but a large chunk of the people that were working at UMax ended up going to Philips to work on LCD display controllers. So interesting times in general. So Philips was the on and the off ramp of sorts. I mean, it was an interstitial thing. Wait, did I say between? Oh, between UMax and Philips, that's not quite right. It was, for me, it was between Philips and Leapfrog. So I should fix that. UMax at Philips, and then Leapfrog. But what about in between there? Okay, got to keep those memories straight while I still have them. So Kay and I worked at Philips directly as employees, and to be honest, we learned a lot about starting with very little knowledge about a topic. In this case, LCD displays, controller, hardware, VESA standards, that's VESA, and so on. So we didn't really know what was going on, but we knew we were smart. We knew we could figure it out, and we did. Getting a new system up and running, that was fun. We had done that quite a bit at UMax, so yeah, Philips was new, but also some of the same stuff again. Hardware is fun. D, also an employee at UMax, was consulting for our group at Philips, but did not actually join, as we would learn later, he was largely spending his time supporting his own startup effort, which involved designing and manufacturing some hardware with some angel funding from our former colleagues at UMax. Some of the management team there. Everybody at UMax, UMax was a pretty tight-knit group. It was a fun team. So not too surprising. Okay, I had to pause there for a second. It probably sounds like a cut or something, but a quick pause. Philips was looking to be a pile of frustration soon after Y2K, like very soon after. Basically, everybody came back from the vacation, the holiday vacation time, and it was like, things are actually getting weirder. And eventually, Kay and I would find ourselves looking beyond Philips as the group sort of fell out with the management of Philips, the company. Our team was fine, but it was politically a very strange place. It was an interesting time, though, in general, and eventually Dee came to us and described what he had been working on. We went to his home and saw he had a little back office area where it was like a little separate, like, what do they call it? The in-law apartment or something? Like, it's a tiny space, but enough for some work. So we went out to the back there and we saw what he was working on. It was a setup for a demo. We'll get to the demo in a moment, but basically the time to depart Philips was at hand. It was a very weird company, as it turns out. It was a huge company. At the time we were working there, it was somewhere between 150 and 200,000 people worldwide. There could be bigger companies, but it was certainly the biggest company I had and would ever work for. When I worked for Intel, it was only about 100,000. It was a very weird company, though. Yeah, an interesting collection of experiences, but ultimately just another big company. And yeah, Intel would be the only other big company after. I've had enough. We've touched on the Intel story, so small is the way to go. So the idea would be to work for Dee and his startup on a flat rate consulting basis and see where we could take it. So he didn't hire us on per se. Since we all knew each other, it was one of those like, I'll just pay you flat rate every month and we'll see if we can do it. And we only have a certain amount of time, money. And so we'll see. I would not have done that arrangement with anyone who I did not know. And I knew his funding sources, so we all knew each other. So it was a leap of faith, but yeah, I don't know if I would do that again. Nothing bad came of this per se, but that was slightly naive, maybe. So here's the demo. What was this thing that Dee had been working on? It was Dee and Jay again, Dee's colleague from Apple. Jay was actually kind of famous in the PowerPC 601 days, but that's another story. So they knew each other from working together at Apple. They had come up with a hardware cache device. Actually, Dee had come up with that, and Jay wrote some software drivers for it that could make use of trailing edge memory. So if you bought a new computer that was using the new DDR, double data rate memory, and then your what were they called? It was EDO, and then they went to SDRAM, I think it was. And then they went to DDR. Something, there was some interstitial. Maybe it was EDO DIMMs that he was using. I don't remember. It's been a while. I could look it up, but basically it was during a transition of memory type. So he figured, and this was the first product, prototype. So he said, yeah, you can take all the old memory out of your old computer and use it to populate this card, so you don't have to throw it away. I was like, okay, interesting. That was one interesting thing. It was a battery backed, so that means you would, if you turned off your computer, it would retain the data in the RAM, but it was not a solid state disk drive, so it was as fast as RAM over a PCI bus. It was something a little bit more complicated than a RAM disk, but it was battery backed, so it would behave similar to a RAM disk, and it could actually behave as a RAM disk, although we were using it as a block cache. It could be installed in just about any computer with a PCI slot. Today, everybody uses PCIe slots, but this is PCI. Probably could have been implemented in a different way, but that's for another time. Like, it probably could have been implemented as an M2 device with less memory, or as a multi-lane PCIe device, and then you could, anyway, there's a couple different ways this could go. because PCIe it kind of slows down the memory accesses. So although now we're on like 5th generation PCIe, who knows? That's for another time. Here was the demo. This is what we saw. D set up 2 Windows machines. Of course, they were UMax branded Windows machines, which I think K had designed the motherboards for. Neat. UMax branded computers, and kicked off some sort of disk heavy collection of operations that would appear visually. So there was like windows moving around and graphics being drawn and updated, all kinds of stuff going on. But it was moving files off of a disk and then displaying them and doing whatever it was doing. So it was disk heavy stuff. So one of the computers would finish all these tasks at its own pace. It was doing its thing, and you can kind of hear the disk going and the light blinking. This is the old days. And the other, maybe I think it was on the right, the other one would finish more quickly. You could see that it was chugging away and doing whatever it was doing more quickly. And then you could see the slow, quote unquote, slower machine. You're like, oh yeah, okay, now it's doing the same thing, but later. So it's slower. And then you could see that the faster machine, you didn't hear the disk, and then you didn't see the disk light, the blinking LED, well, probably red, I think. So at some point you're like, oh yeah, like it's done. And it was quiet. So audibly less disk activity, to be sure. And then he could do the same demo again and just show that, look, you can't even hear the disk going. It's still doing all the stuff. Now, this is I'll just going off script here. This kind of a demo, it's called a demo path. It's designed to show the features you want to show. Maybe it's the features that are working or the features that really make the product look good. But it doesn't necessarily show like the general use case. That's why benchmarks and demos are only benchmarks and demos. They are not, what is it? They're not indicators of future earnings. So it was a nice demo, but as we'll soon see, it was not the whole story. There's nothing nefarious going on here. It's just that it was solving one problem, but not another. Caching, it's caching, plain and simple, really. We had a level 3 cache product in development at UMax for the Macintosh clones that we were making. It ended up being buggy, and it was too buggy to ship, so we didn't. But it was an L3 cache that sat between the processor and main memory. So we kind of had a cache, and I learned all about caching from that, and bus snooping and cache snooping and MESI protocol. What does MESI stand for? Is it mutual? Modified, exclusive, shared, invalid. MESI. So there was status bits for each cache line and all that stuff. So I learned all about caching. Very interesting. The kind of stuff that is very practical. So for engineering, from an engineering perspective, it was totally educational, even though it didn't ship. But caching in general was front of mind. And so D had conceived of and then built this product. He was a hardware person, so he designed this PCI expansion card with a bunch of memory slots and a memory controller and battery power circuitry and so on. So fundamentally a fairly basic card. Nowadays, you'd probably implement this with, I don't know if there's memory controllers anymore. They're onboard a processor. So I don't know how that would work out today. Maybe it wouldn't. D, that's not funny. I just said, it's like, wow, things have changed so much in the decades. D and J had the hardware at a functional state and software drivers in a usable state, respectively. D worked on the hardware, J on the software drivers. So the cache scheme could be tested and demonstrated, which is always nice. If you're going to start a company and you have a working demo, you are way ahead. It was very much a demo mode presentation, though, with a demo path, not to be strayed from. The goal with K and my joining, the effort was going to be continuing to develop the software implementation with a user experience and any other innovation we might come up with. And we all knew that it was in our natures to what would make this even better kind of thing from our times at UMax and Philips. So we knew each other to be innovators and outside the box thinkers and all that. So that was good. And D and K, K also being new, but K was one of the smartest people I ever knew. So D and K would probably come up with some hardware tweaks for another generation of the card, the expansion card, the PCI card. I would work with Jay to get a Linux kernel driver implementation in place for server-side applications. And now these were not the days of the cloud as we know today. This was before AWS and GCP and Azure, depending on how you'd like to pronounce that. But there were servers. People, you could have your own server. You could even do your own server in a rack. Even though, these were the early days of that, but yeah, there were certainly servers in the cloud, people hosting websites and all that stuff. So Linux was a player. Today, it's basically taken over that space. So having a Linux version was more important than having a Mac version. So I was working on the kernel drivers to control block moving disk blocks between disk and the card, and I don't know if we ever got a RAM disk going. A RAM disk was like the super easiest version of this, so I can't remember how I went about it. But eventually, the Linux version was a couple months behind the Windows version because Jay had spent like countless weeks working on it, and I kind of came in profoundly late to that party. But anyway, work in progress. We had months of runway ahead of us. We were getting paid a reasonable amount of money, and it was fun. It was a fun group of people to work with. Hang on a second. All right, that was another pause. Sorry. So here's the plan. We had a small team of nerdles. We all knew each other, and a functioning project. Not quite a product, but it was an early development version of a product. It was on its way to becoming a product, certainly. There was enough funded runway for about a year that we had planned, and some early talks about potential customer or partner investor. Interesting. That's not an awful place to be when it's essentially a one-person startup with Jay adding his time and then myself and Kay joining in. Like, oh, you have money for a full year, but you already have a functioning piece of hardware and software that basically works, at least for demo purposes. So that's not a bad place. If we had visited a coffee shop and sat down and said, here's what we're going to do. We have a year and we have no hardware, and that would have been a completely different story. But here it was like, oh, wow, because we are running. We have hit the ground, most definitely running. These were early days. We only had the 1 year, basically. But D had done a lot of the entrepreneurial legwork. Obviously had funding. So having the funding in place to enable the runway, though somewhat short, spelled with an H nowadays, short. This was, of course, very useful. I don't know if we would have actually been able to do anything if he had not done that foundational work, right? Having money and doing the hardware. When you do hardware in a small number of, you're an individual and you're going to prototype something. Now, clearly we all knew the right people to talk to from our time at UMax. And so making a prototype and getting the parts and all that was a little bit easier. But yeah, when you're one person, you want build me 4 of these or 5 or whatever. That's a little bit more challenging than, hey, I work at Supermicro, make me 1,000 prototype boards. You're going to get those a lot easier. But so he did a lot of that work up front, had the money all sorted out and everything. So these early days, and then of course having the functioning software thanks to Jay, made everything easier. Not easy, but easier, certainly. The runway was short, but that's what startups were. Getting hardware done can always be a hit or miss kind of thing. So having it already working, and D was a meticulous hardware engineer, so it was pretty solid. And it can be unexpectedly expensive. It's like when you open a restaurant, really, you're like, oh, we didn't know we were going to have to replumb the grease traps and pull up the sidewalk. Suddenly your entire project goes 2x over budget or something. So hardware can be similar to that. Hardware is hard. It's right there in the name. So the fact that this was already running was a good confidence boost to make the use of that 1 year, I think it was about a year of runway ahead of us. So we started working on our various innovation notions rather quickly. We were pretty much, again, hitting the ground running. And in short order, we had very basic Linux functionality and ongoing caching functionality with some additional ideas working with the Windows file system. So all the work that Jay had done. Unfortunately, Jay's work could not move directly over to Linux, so that was a little bit of a learning curve to fit it in. And in the, like over the years, similar functionality has become sort of normal. Like if you want to use a memory, a RAM memory device as a cache of some sort, that I think that part is solved. So we would have had a leg up if we had done it a couple years later, but that's how the world works. There was no talk of a Mac port, which I found a little bit odd, but given our histories, so no Mac port, not at that time anyway, and then of course not at all. At some point, we learned that there were some discussions with someone at a major chip company, which I will not name, that was essentially the big name in hardware RAID and SCSI controllers. So those are, RAID is redundant array of inexpensive disks and small computer systems interface. That's SCSI. If you're a Mac person, you remember SCSI. And thanks to a collaboration from the UMax days, so the investors in Motive Power knew this person at this other company. There was this possibility on the table of something, and this injected a certain amount of cautious optimism into the near term. Like, oh, okay, this runway could get longer. Not so bad. So the question was, I usually play the role of the skeptic or the realist, maybe the curmudgeon, more so lately. So fairly shortly after this revelation that there was this conversation happening and a couple of meetings with the stakeholders and decision makers, between them, not me, myself and Kay, we were just doing our innovating. We were not doing our negotiating. Something occurred to me which prompted a meeting with D to talk about these meetings. D was in on the meetings, as far as I'm aware. So this is a humble brag, but it did lead to an aha or maybe a lean-in moment of sorts. Looking back today, I have to wonder if I should have been in the room for the business meetings, or at least had a complete picture. I only kind of had second and third hand recollections, so we were not brought in on the details of the meeting. So that would have been nice before I developed this take, but I did have my views based on what I could see, and again, sort of a humble brag that D was like, oh yeah, I didn't really think about that. So let's put the two things together here. And I have not gone into sufficient detail, just as I did not have sufficient detail. So hopefully you're following along. The demo showing the cache function and benefit included the clear absence of disk activity to show off that caching was taking place, and it correlated to faster performance. Or at least it was perceptively faster. Perceptive? The perception of speed. I mean, when you think about it, the way caches work, you kind of have to do the same things over and over. So that's, again, the demo path was showing. You don't want to show the parts where it's not faster. So your demo is the definition of motivated reasoning, right? We're only going to pick evidence that supports our claim that this is a worthwhile product. The company on the other side of these talks specialized in hardware that made disk access faster and more reliable. That's SCSI and SCSI 3 and RAID, respectively. So plain and simple, they were into disks. They were the de facto standard in this area, the name everybody knew. And here, this product from Motive Power makes disks less essential, according to the demo. So why on earth would they be looking to get involved with this project? Why indeed? So I had two theories. They either wanted to get in on this innovation in storage system acceleration to expand their offerings in general, and that's not unreasonable. Or they wanted to kill this off early, and when the spend would be small. So if they're getting in first after the angel investors, doing an early round, an A round, then they're getting in very cheaply. The person on their side of the conversation was a friend to those on our side. So it was entirely possible that this was a serious look at expanding their portfolio with a new technology developed by a company built by familiar people. So it wasn't wasn't outlandish, but still, it bothered me. It's like, well, nowadays you have to reimagine oil companies as energy companies, but this would have been equivalent back then to Exxon investing in Toyota Prius products. Like, wait, the entire goal is to use less gasoline, thus less oil. And of course, the answer could either be, well, we want to buy the car and then put it out of business, or we want to be an energy company and invest in anything that consumes energy or makes energy, produces energy, provides energy. So, yeah, which was it? So we had a sprint ahead of us now. And I had this conversation with Dee, and I said, so could it be one of these things? So if the former theory was correct, that is that they wanted to expand their catalog, that this new thing that we were building would fit into the general product offerings of that company, then we wanted to offer some ideas how that might work out. Like, what does it mean to have cache and really fast and reliable disk access? The existing demo showing speed and silence thanks to using cache rather than disk for file accesses. In the demo path scenario, I mean, caches have their place. The demo would remain, it was still useful, but we wanted to show other scenarios for how this caching device would fit into the other company's use cases. So like, what does it mean to have fast and reliable disk storage, but then not have to use it all the time because you have data in a big giant cache, battery back cache. Now disks have a cache. Usually the cache is like small. We were talking, I mean, at the time, you didn't have 16, 32, 64 gigabytes of RAM on a motherboard, much less a PCI card. So this was, maybe it got up to a gigabyte of RAM. I don't know if it went, maybe it was more like 512 megabytes or something, fully populated. That escapes me, but that's still a very large cache compared to the file system cache and system RAM. So your operating system maintains a disk cache of sorts. And then there's caches on the actual physical disk hardware back when people were using rotating disks. So there's different caches here and there. So caches are not like yes or no, but we were adding this big giant battery backed interstitial caching device. So it offered some possibilities. So at the time, Kay and I lived walking distance from each other. So I used to walk over to his place, and our collaboration daily, working on. So he was driving. We were kind of like pair programming. So he would drive. He would be sitting at his computer with the card installed, and we would be coming up with the two sides of our caching strategy designed to complement and even amplify the storage system focus of the other company's hardware. They were about what they offered was about having many disks, many fast disks, and with RAID, they had many and fast disks with redundancy in case of disk failures. So you had a fairly robust, reliable storage system that was there for you when you needed it at a performance level that was acceptable or better for whatever applications, certainly enterprise grade. I don't know about carrier grade, but yeah, you do some big file transfers, store big files. Our goal was to not avoid disk, because that didn't make sense. We didn't want the disks to go silent as in the first demo. We wanted them to be spinning like crazy. We wanted to make use of them even more. That's crazy. So the two sides of caching that we were proposing were reactive caching, which is the way caches work in the general case. Copy back and write through are both available already. So we could like if we were caching an application, like if you're loading an application, you're not going to typically when you're executing an application, you're not going to be altering it. So if you read that into the cache and you had to evict it from the cache, you could delete it. You didn't have to, you just invalidate it, done, and overwrite it. If you read in your resume or some spreadsheet or something, you would read it into the cache and then it could stay there. And then if you wrote to it, if you edited your spreadsheet or your resume, then you could either store it in the cache called copy back, And then if you had to evict the file, or I think we were starting out with block caching. So if the blocks in the cache had to be written out to disks, then you would copy them back to disk. Or you could write through the cache. So reads were from the cache, but writes were to the cache and to the disk. So that's copy back, write through, and then read only. You can cache, but you don't have to, you can just invalidate. You don't have to copy back or anything. You don't have to worry about it. Just throw it away. So if you read something from disk, it would be stored in the cache, period. And if you read it again, it would be read from the cache. So it's all faster. So we had the block caching already. We were looking at file caching in general. And I think on Windows there was some file caching, but I think they started off with block caching because that fit automatically into the like Windows had the facilities in their operating system to add on additional block caches because the operating system was doing block caching. So a block cache, if you always read the beginning of a file and the end of a file, you only need to store the two blocks that comprise the file in your cache. And the middle of the file, which could be huge, you may not need that all the time. So those can come in and out of caching as needed. So you don't need to cache the entire file. But if you're doing a file cache, you may be reading in the entire file. So kind of in the middle would be, well, we can cache the parts of the file that we need, and we can, well, so if we knew we had files, not just blindly caching blocks, then we could do something called proactive caching. And that was the other side of the caching story. So this is probably something you find more easily nowadays. I think it happens more frequently. File level, like web requests are file cache requests. They're proactive caching. If you load a web page, you can often do speculative loads. So it will preloads, they call it. I think it's preload. So you can preload a font or a JavaScript file or an image before you actually need it. Similar idea. So proactive caching, this is something you probably find now. The idea was to keep track of file accesses over time and proactively load those into cache. Production by Street. We would proactively load those into cache before they would typically be needed. So reactive caching is, oh, I need this huge file, read it from disk, put it in the cache, and then now it's, every access afterwards is faster because you're hitting cache memory instead of going to the disk. Disks, you'd be amazed at how much slower disk access is compared to memory access. And memory access is ridiculously slower than onboard memory access in the L2 and L1 caches in your microprocessor. But anyway, that's too nerdy. So if you could load a file into the cache before, then you wouldn't have that initial, it's called a cache miss. So a cache miss says, oh, it's not in the cache. We have to go out to disk, or we have to go out onto the internet. And now we have to wait. So if before the request came, you said, oh, you know what? They're probably going to want this one file. Let's put it in the cache before they need it. Then you wouldn't have a cache miss. Not at the time you needed it. When you're deciding whether to cache something, you would say, is it in the cache? No, let's load it into the cache. So technically a cache miss, but not in a reactive mode, but in a proactive mode. So there you go. This was the part where those fast disks could always be put to use. Since anytime the disks were not servicing other requests for current access, so reactive responses, providing data after it's been asked for by an application or a client of some sort, we could squeeze in some proactive file reads to proactively, or maybe more common today, speculatively, keep data in a faster place based on likely access. And this actually started to work. So we started looking at things like, okay, well, if I launch a application like Word on your Windows machine, the most recent files that were used with Word, we would start looking at, okay, well, these are opened every day. So when the person opens or launches Word, they tend to open these 2 or 3 files every day. Maybe it's like a weekly status report or whatever it is, an invoice, like an ongoing invoice for the week or whatever it is. So you could look at, or maybe they didn't open the same files all the time. So we started to develop a proximal file access notion. So, so after lunch, 1 o'clock or whatever the time was, we would gather statistics on, okay, so around this time of day, the user or the system launches these applications, opens these files together. So when we have time before that, maybe it's lunchtime and maybe nobody's using the computer, for example. So when the load on the disk is low, we can say, oh, we got nothing to do right now. Let's load in a whole bunch of data from the disk. So essentially, we're trying to keep those disks in use more by moving data into the cache. Now, if it moves into the cache and is unmodified, so in other words, our proactive caching scheme makes a bad guess, we can just throw it away. We didn't modify it, so we don't have to do any other disk access action. So, but we can then read in something else speculatively. So our proactive caching model can always move stuff into the cache without worrying about, if we're wrong, we just throw it away. We didn't modify it, so we don't have to worry about extra disk writes. We can just do reads whenever there's available bandwidth that's not being used. We'll say, oh, you're not doing anything right now, disk subsystem. Why don't you load in the files that they typically access in the afternoon or around this time of day, or on a server, maybe these log files that get rotated or whatever it is. You can start planning ahead for these things. So that was the whole notion of proactive caching, and it did start to work. It was like, oh, this is actually pretty cool, and it was happening automatically. So on a website, you encode in your web page that you want to preload things. I'm going to need this JavaScript or this image later, so I'll load it now, and then it'll become, anyway. So yeah, this was happening as a matter of operating system service, not user decision. So that made for sort of automatically more performant desktop, and then by implication server or applications, right? Everything would just seem to work faster, and we're making more use of disk, not less. So the outcome, we were getting a little bit tired of the daily grind and what ended up being something of an all or nothing wager on this other company. So it was kind of like, I don't know. We're kind of getting there, but we have no feedback. We don't know if this is even interesting. So we were betting, and again, I was making a speculation myself onto whether this is what the company was actually looking for. Was like, here, we're going to show you how you can use more of your disk, not less. So this product can work in either mode, right? Avoiding disk or increasing disk accesses. The angel investors were not going to expand their stake if this deal fell through. So this runway had a hard ending to it if the deal didn't happen. So we basically had a ticking clock hooked up to the trapdoor on which we were seated doing our work. This is a reality that most startups go through. So it was not a sob story, but it was a tense reality, to be sure. So at some point we were like, do you want to play Soul Blade? So Kay and I would do our daily, probably like an hour's worth of video games. I'm not really a video game player much, so that's probably telling. Then one day the bad news dropped on us. Before that clock even timed out, that contact on the other side of the table driving their side of the discussion was reorganized into some other role, or maybe out of the company, I don't remember, but that person was no longer a part of our conversation. Not that I was in on it either. And if there was any possibility that a successor would find this collaboration between the company and ours, Motive Power, if they would find it interesting, and that was not a strong possibility as it turned out, the delays introduced by the shuffling of roles and reevaluation of deals and dealings, they had a lot of stuff going on. They were a big player in the space. So, we were a tiny little player, potentially making a competitive product or a product that made their products less appealing. So yeah, we're getting moved to the back pages. This meant that our runway was not long enough anymore. It didn't, unless something crazy happened. It was like, oh, this is not good news. I think D may have continued to work, sort of keep the project on life support. They had put a lot of time and money into building the prototype, and the prototype was actually functional, so there's nothing really wrong with it as a project. The product, though, Jay was around to help out as sort of a founding developer. I believe he was also working on some other things as well. So, Silicon Valley at the time, even though it was coming to the end of the super hot times, it was right around the year 2000. So things would turn south in another year or so. But anyway, so Kay went on and found something else to work on. And I found the consulting gig at Leapfrog Toys. It was the end of the calendar year around then. So at the end of our concerted efforts and ultimately the end of this sort of product. I think the other company shifted over toward killing the notion after that reorg, and battery-backed memory cards became so niche that you barely hear of them. I think you could probably find one today. I know over the years I've looked to see if anybody ever tried to do something similar, and there were similar products actually over the years. They never really take off. They're just niche. You can do memory access is very fast. For a little while, memory was fairly cheap. And then solid state disks came around and Intel did something really interesting in more recent years, in the last 10 years, with their Octane line of storage products. But even though the Octane products were performant and very popular, they were too niche and they were killed off rather quickly. So they were very cool, but for too few people or companies or whatever. Maybe it was the rise of solid state disks, SSDs, and especially NVMe drives and whatnot, that kind of obfuscated the need for interstitial acceleration. Before we all had any idea what AI would do to pricing and availability of course, of SSDs and storage in general and memory. But for a little while, up until 2 or 3 years ago, you were almost tripping over it. Like, oh, do you want some more memory with that? Would you like a large memory configuration? Now it's like, where do you think you're going to get some memory from? You don't have enough money. We don't even need to ask you how much money you have. You don't have enough. So the take home lesson from Motive Power from me, it was a learning experience. The people funding D and Motive Power were friends and family, and that's how angel funding works. They believed in the person, and as we would come to learn, had not really thought through the product as much. The dealings with the other company were evidence of this. It all hinged on one person not getting reorganized out of his job. So that's the way it is. And again, I don't know what would have happened if we didn't sort of think this through with the proactive caching option. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things. Working with friends can be totally fun and educational, and both were true here. But ultimately, the friends dynamic did give way to the founder versus worker dynamic. That is basically D and K and myself, or so we'll just say between D and me, right? I mean, I can speak for myself. It just makes it a little bit weird. Personally, I found management to be a little bit weak for reasons I described just now, that they didn't really plan ahead for this deal or what was going to happen, like how are we going to enter the market. So the product market fit, and today you'd ask for the TAM and the SAM and the whatever, total addressable market and all that stuff. So those were kind of unknown. It was more like, an engineer. I've always said this, engineers want to design products that are super duper cool that will never see the light of day because they don't do marketing or sales. So unless you know that, if you're an engineer that understands that, then you're like, oh, I got to make a product that people want. So I found management to be a little weak, a little bit. I'm not trying to be insulting. I'm just saying that, in hindsight, you're like, oh, that could have used a little bit more thinking, more planning. As far as direction and potential, I think a lot was left to, we'll see. Day-to-day interaction was totally fine. And it may or may not have been appropriate to ask that we were even more involved with some of the stuff as we were. Like, hey, can we come to that meeting? Can we have more conversations about what's going to happen when the runway runs out? Or is there a plan B if that one company doesn't come through on it? Like, those things were kind of left to them to talk about, and we were focusing on our stuff. But it started with 4 people. I did not see a completely healthy dynamic overall. Like, I think if you're all kind of betting on this thing and it's only 4, it's not like it was 40 people, it was 4. So I think the 4 of us could have been more, not to take anything away from the hierarchy, but I think in some cases there could have been a sort of a flat management scheme in place, like keeping everybody up to date, keeping everybody informed on where we were headed, what the plan was. So I think there were some things that were kind of left to chance. And even, I mean, I guess somebody at some point would say, well, you were only consulting. And that's where, again, I would say, I don't know if I would do that again for a situation like that. I would probably ask for more money today, right? But yeah, I think if I was going to be consulting or on a consulting basis, I would probably be for a company where I didn't know the people as well, because that just makes it a little bit more clear that there is that line of demarcation. Yeah. I learned a lot. I learned a lot from the experience. It wasn't quite a year, if I'm remembering correctly, because I went to work at Leapfrog in November of 2000. Yeah, November of 2000, I think it was. And I worked until the summer of 2001. And then I was living in Phoenix in August of 2001. And everything changed in September. So we've already gone through that. So I learned a lot. I always have at every place I've worked in any role learned a lot. So that's pretty standard. This probably added to my desire to head for the exit from Silicon Valley, though, with Leapfrog holding the door open for my relocation back to Phoenix by the end of that time. The time to pursue a startup like that one, Motive Power, may have been maybe a year or two prior, when the momentum there was still at scale. I think it was already sort of winding down, but there was still enough energy in Silicon Valley that if we had started it, maybe if we started when we left UMax, but then there wouldn't have been hardware. So theories. The time at Philips, which was itself something of an escape as UMax was shutting down, so it wasn't the best circumstances. It was a rescue mission. It wasn't necessarily like, oh, this is awesome. It was a preamble to what would be for me a departure from Silicon Valley. It was like, you know what? Maybe this isn't what it used to be. Although I would head back for my second tour 4 years later. And that is a totally different story that I've told some parts of before. I'll probably come up with little nuggets like this one from the first tour. So Motive Power was a brief window, a brief look through that window into a 4-person startup doing something which was actually cool, but did not have product market fit worked out and didn't have the runway to work that out. And the timing was wrong for the economy. Things were starting to turn down. There was less money floating around. There was less interest in novelty. The reorg at that other company was very telling in that regard. Like, what is all this new thinking? No. We gotta hunker down and save money and maintain profitability and all that stuff. So yeah, things were changing at the time. So it was bad timing. Questions about product market fit. We could have had a lot more in the way of almost like not total agile, like Scrum stand-ups and all that stuff, but we could have had a lot more stuff sort of spelled out, what we were trying to accomplish and how. And with 4 people, it could very easily have taken the agile basis, the whole team approach, figuring out who our customers are, what do they need and why, right? That's essentially what I did with the reimagining with proactive caching, right? We don't want to use less disk. We want to use more disk. So that's one of those user story scenarios where you'd say, well, as an enterprise user or as a corporate, I've spent a lot of money on fast hard drives. Why do I want to use them less? So that was an entire different direction. And the product, the notion of the hardware and the drivers and so on was flexible enough so that we could try that new direction. So that was a win. I think it was a learning experience in general, what to do, what not to do, and who to try to do it with. And there you go. That was Motive Power. And again, I don't know if you would ever find any evidence that existed unless you looked for, which I have not done. You might be able to find something for a corporation if it was formed in California. I honestly don't know if it was formed in California or Delaware or whatever. And there might be a patent, maybe. Don't know. That's it. That was Motive Power. Now, there are too many other things, too many other irons in the fire right now, but hopefully I will have learned enough from that, among other experiences. Like I said, I've learned from all of my work experiences. I've learned this or that or both. So, lately I've been learning a lot more about how important or not important the ecosystem is. But that's a conversation for another time. That's it. End of story. Where I got right around 1 hour. So with silence truncation, I'm going to say 55 minutes. Just a guess. Thanks for listening as always. Take care of yourself and make sure your caches are flushed. Bye-bye.